start, please? Thank you all for being here today. I realize it's just after lunch, so it will be a struggle, but the topic we're discussing today is actually very, very important and quite different from the morning sessions. So we're looking forward to the discussion. My name is Sara Kayali. I'm the Syria researcher with Human Rights Watch. Before I introduce the panel and my fellow panelists, just a few notes. This session, as you know, is on the record and open to the media. There will be a questions and answers session after our discussion. And I'd encourage you to contribute and tweet about the conference on Twitter using the hashtag #CHSyria. Thank you all for being here today. This session actually pivots away from the topic of the morning sessions. We're moving away from reconstruction and the geopolitical challenges associated with it to discuss another fundamental component of inclusive peace building, and that's social cohesion. The panel today has three objectives. One is to discuss the main drivers of deterioration in social cohesion and social capital within the Syrian context. It will explore mechanisms by different actors to increase polarization in Syrian society. And then the panelists will try to propose policy options to restore Syria's social capital. Very easy, so easy. I'll just introduce my fellow panelists very quickly. On my immediate left is Zaki Mahshi. He's an Academy Asfari Fellow at Chatham House, working on non-state actors dynamic in Syria during the conflict. He's also a co-founder of the Syrian Center for Policy Research. His work focuses on development policies and the socio-economic impact of the crisis in Syria, as well as the labor force, demography, local governance, and community empowerment. Alaa Berri is the program manager of the Chatham House Middle East and North Africa program. She's currently undertaking a PhD in social policy with a focus on refugees integration in Europe at the University of Birmingham. Berri previously worked in the humanitarian field, specifically with refugees at the beginning of the Syrian crisis. And last but not least, Rowan Ljoule is an independent researcher with more than 10 years of experience in geopolitics, political research, counterterrorism, and strategic communications. She's currently working with the research department at the Brookings Doha Center and has previously worked as the Middle East and North Africa analyst at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change in the United Kingdom. They're all wonderful, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you. Maybe I'll start with you, Zaki, with the first question. What is social cohesion and what are its foundations? Can you tell us a bit more about what the developmental implications of social cohesion is, particularly in the Syrian context?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Sarah. Actually, the social cohesion is a very complicated concept, but if we want to talk in a very simple way, social cohesion is about the cooperation or the willingness to cooperate between different members in a specific society. And this is very important, or it has very important social, economic, and institutional impact, not only on the individuals, but also on the society in general. Social cohesion can be seen as the link or the connector that link the different social, economic, and institutional actors within one community. And this links or this connections, if we can say, is getting stronger with better social networks, with better participation, and with more trust between people within the specific society. The concept actually is very dynamic. It changed constantly, especially during the crisis, and that's what we are facing in Syria now, a large deterioration in the social cohesion in Syria because of the crisis. It includes intangible components like values, norms, and most importantly, it reflects the power distribution within a society. That's why it's very important to understand social cohesion, especially during the crisis. And that's why many scholars try to quantify the concept of social cohesion so that to be able to measure and to evaluate the impact of any of the overall circumstances on the social cohesion and social capital. And of course, the main index that is used to reflect social cohesion is the social capital index. It is developed by Bourdieu, by Putnam, and of course, it's been used by the World Bank. So we have the social capital index to reflect or to quantify the concept of social cohesion. Now, the social capital index itself has three main components. The first one is about, the first component is about the participation and social networks. The second component is about trust between people, individuals within one society, and also trust between individuals and the authorities and the institutions that manage the situation in this society. And the third component is about norms and values. And this includes, of course, justice. It includes also the common values in one society. There are also types for social capital in general. And here I would like to talk about two main types. The first one is the bonding social capital, which reflects the relation between people or members in, for example, one family or one local communities. And we have the bridging social capital, which reflects the relation between individuals and the de facto authority or the institutions in a country. So, for example, in Syria or in general during crisis, usually the bonding social capital increase, where people try to reconnect with their traditional institution like family, like local communities. And at the same time, the bridging social capital decrease. So which reflects a decreasing in social cohesion at national level. And of course, the bonding social capital increase polarization during crisis. So people come together, support each other during crisis, and this, with the investment in identity politics, could increase largely polarization and the hatred against the others. So we have this type of social capital. And of course, in terms of the impact of social capital, all literature reviews showed that there is a positive correlation between social capital index and, for example, economic growth, or with better performance in health or in education. So it's very important element to achieve inclusive development, to have social cohesion. And at the same time, the inclusive development increase the social capital or social cohesion, if we can say. One last point I want to mention about social capital and social cohesion, that it plays a very important role in terms of achieving positive institutional change. And this, we can see this during the first months of the demonstration in Syria, where people show a high level of bridging social capital, because when people demonstrate during the first months in Syria, they were asking for freedom and human rights, not only for their own local communities, but for all Syrian people. And this reflects a very high level of bridging social capital. So social capital and social cohesion could be very important in terms of achieving positive institutional change.
Thank you, Zaki, for that comprehensive framework. It's definitely a complicated concept, and you can see very clearly the relationship between social cohesion and inclusive peace building, because you really can't even start to have these conversations without looking at the state of Syrian society today after 8 years of conflict. And maybe with that, I'll turn to Rawan with the next question. How did the conflict affect social cohesion in Syria?
So, first of all, thank you for the introduction. I just want to highlight that the Syrian society, has been going through conflicts since its independence in 1946. For this specific crisis, what we're seeing is, we have 6 months of peaceful protests, peaceful uprising, as Zaki mentioned, asking for national and international rights. That within 6 months it turned into armed conflict, and there started the rise of violence. However, it's very important to not only look at the armed conflict to measure the social cohesion. But for instance, the Syrian Center for Policy Research in 2017, they I had to. It's important to mention that the social cohesion is a topic that is understudied, and when I was doing my research, I only came across the publication of the Syrian Center for Policy Research on that. So I had to quote you. They stated in their 2017 the social degradation in Syria. They stated that 30% that the social index of social capital decreased 30%. And as Zaki mentioned, the social capital, we're talking about social values, we're talking about the bonds and the networks. Within that context as well, I want to take a step back from the academia and be closer to the real lives of people in Syria, in Syrian society. And what we're seeing now is that is a natural reaction to the institutions that have been in place in Syria. I mean, the Syrian has been, since the 70s, there has been a systematic educational indoctrination to certain ideology, to a certain way of dealing with the society. So when you go to school, you only have, the Ba'athist kind of ideology. You go to Talaya, and then when you are in school, you have the Shabiba, and then when you are in university, you have this another type of also affiliated with the Ba'ath ideology. And there is no place for other, let's say, civil society or NGOs to play out within the society. It has been only one certain thinking, one certain line. So when the revolution or when the uprising in 2011 happened, and then 6 months afterward we have violence, the Syrians started to react as they were perceived. I mean, as Paulo Freire in his book said, a Brazilian philosopher, in his book, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, he said, and I quote, "The practice of freedom is a practice of domination." So what we're seeing now is not that the Syrians were living in another planet, and these are like unknown practices. They lived that, and this is a natural reaction to what they have been living before. I don't know if I answered your question, but that's my.
I want to go ahead.
I just want to highlight the impact of the crisis on social capital index. As Rawan mentioned, the social capital index, or the constructed social capital index, compared to the time before the crisis, in 2015 decreased by 30%. And it's very important to mention that this kind of index, in general, all social indices or all social indicators, usually they change very slowly during time. So to lose 30% of the quantified social cohesion in only 4 years, this reflects the catastrophe. This reflects a large deterioration in everything and the catastrophic impact of the crisis on social cohesion. And also there is an important point here to highlight. This decrease happened at national level, but at the same time, the index shows that in some region, the social capital increased. For example, in Kurdish authority-controlled area, some regions in Kurdish authority-controlled area, some region in Idlib, some region in coastal area, the social capital index increased, and this reflects what I mentioned before, the increasing impact of the bonding social capital at the expense of the bridging social capital, which should be at national level. So we have a deterioration at national level, but we have some increase in some regions, which reflects the polarization, which may reflect the investment in identity politics by the de facto authorities to increase this bonding between families and to increase loyalists for them. Yeah.
And Ron, can I ask, what does this really sort of look like on the ground when we say there's been a decrease in social cohesion? What does this mean among the Syrian populace? What does it mean in terms of their relationship to state institutions? And if we're sort of forward-looking, what does it mean if we're talking about inclusive peace building? Like, how do we repair these relationships?
Well, that's a very important question. So, Sarah, if we want to look at it, before looking at the future, I think that we have to look at the present and a little bit probably at the history and the past. The thing is now, and one of the things that I will add to Zaki, probably a lot of us know that part of the Syrian society structure is the role of intelligence. I mean, it's embedded heavily in the society structure. And this produces certain behavior. I mean, let's say, if you dare to talk about something or critique something, you're afraid because probably, your neighbor will hear you and they will write a report, kitab al-taqarir. And then, you are afraid. There is a culture of fear. There's a culture of, as Zaki mentioned, there is, the distrust and the lack of social trust is deteriorating even worse. I mean, even more. Why? Because now if we look at the map in Syria, we see different territories of influence. And each and every area is controlled by a certain group, different than the other. And every one of them, they have, in a way or another, maybe names are different, but actually for the Syrians themselves, they are, let's say, authoritarian. I mean, they're not modeled for freedom. They're not modeled for human rights. So let's say in Idlib, you have a certain type of extremism, religious extremism. There that, manifest kind of fear. In cities in general that are under the government control, there is also fear and there's also distrust from everyone and the fear. I mean, any Syrian now wants to go back, they have to check whether or not they have their names on the intelligence list. So there is this culture of fear, and that's where and that's something unified in all different controlled areas by different control people. Everybody, is fearing for him or herself. So this is what you see, on a national level, and then things are different from area to area. For instance, the type of social life, let's say, in our social society, our type of social activities or social cohesion in certain area, like northeast Syria, is totally different than the ones you can see in the ones that are controlled by the government, and definitely different than the one in Idlib. I am all for inclusiveness. I am all for, inclusive peace building. But I'm just, when we sit Syrians together, we just try to see how can we bridge these severe polarized areas. There is polarization, and the polarization is not only on one angle. It's multi-dimensioned. And that's where it's very heavy, or it's a challenging situation to have this thing. And I wonder, and when I sit with my fellow Syrians, like, yes, I am for inclusiveness, but how? I am all for institutions, but how? How can we break these very, these common ideas with across Syrians, wherever you sit with, or whoever you sit with, they have these same ideas. I just wonder how.
And on that, I think this panel is supposed to answer this question, so he'll definitely come to it. Yeah, but I want to go to Ella for a bit and add another complexity to the conversation. Talking about almost half of the population has been either displaced within Syria or outside of it. So how does that affect social cohesion in Syria? And maybe if you can talk about how do you see social cohesion and the conditions for return to Syria? Sort of how do they go together? What has to be in place for that to happen?
Thank you, Sarah. So yeah, as you said, 50% of the population have been displaced. This had led to fragmentation in the social structures, and of course affected the social capital, which usually established the foundations for social cohesion. We can see that communities that have been subject to large scale of displacement, like Idlib, Hasake, Raqqa, were the most to suffer from a decline in the social capital. Here I want to also explain how this affected the social cohesion through three different models. First, we can see that this conflict led to disappearance of whole communities and the emergence of new communities. And this is evident in Raqqa, for example, even before ISIS were existed. We can see that people were fleeing Raqqa, and it got worse after the emergence of ISIS. Now almost the entire city is not in Raqqa anymore. There is also the second model is how the regime is working systematically on forcing people to flee some areas, and as Stephen mentioned, emptying entire areas to serve his plan in changing demography and plan Syria in under his terms. This can be seen also in Kafraya or in Foa, and how people were forced to flee based on sectarian bases. The last model, we can see the new different social dynamics that have emerged in between IDPs and host communities. Take, for example, there is difference between those who have fled from Ghouta to Idlib, and those who have fled from Ghouta to areas under the regime control. There's different dynamics, there's different social tension, and these IDPs were forced to depend on international and local humanitarian aid, which of course affected them socially and psychologically, and affected their relation and trust with the host community. So yes, of course, the population movement have affected the social cohesion. Now, what can be done to enable IDPs and refugees to return to their areas and restore social cohesion? First, we need to work on inclusive social development that assure justice and rights of all Syrian individuals, whether those who are inside Syria or outside Syria. We need to develop social policies that that are flexible and fit into the characteristics and circumstances of each community, and also refugee return should not come before reaching a political settlement that assure that these refugees will be able to return to their original cities and will be able to reclaim their rights of whether properties and resources. One last note. International donors should assure that their fund or any capacity building activities do not worsen any social tension between communities under different authorities. That's it.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I just want to add on the drivers behind the deterioration of social capital. As Ala mentioned, the movement or the population movement is one of the main determinants of the deterioration in social capital index. We have also other drivers. We have education. When the education is, the enrollment, for example, in school decreased, social capital index decreased. So there is a correlation, positive correlation between these two. We have the health situation, but we also have the level of violence, and we have the level of conflict economy activities. So in the regions that the people involved more in conflict-related activities, we can see that the index, the social capital index, is lower than other regions. So these are, in general, the determinants, or if we can say, the drivers behind the deterioration of social capital index in Syria.
Okay, interesting. And I think one of the things that I would actually like to come back to is precisely when we talk about the return of refugees and how it corresponds to or can advance social cohesion. Who are the actors that these recommendations are directed to? But would you like to respond to this now, or maybe we can come back to it in the discussion?
One important point related to this, if we're gonna speak about refugee return, which whether we like it or not, it's happening. We need to assure that the EU or the UN take part of monitoring this process and involving civil society and community leaders to assure that no one is forced to return to areas under the regime control where they or being arrested after they returned back to the country.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think in terms of access and transparency, these are both huge issues in terms of monitoring the safety of returnees. Related to that, in the previous panels, we've discussed sort of the benefits of economic reconstruction, what kind of leverage there is. But I think the question for us today is, which one comes first, social cohesion or economic reconstruction? Would reconstruction alone be enough to improve social cohesion, or do you need to actually improve social cohesion as a precondition for successful reconstruction?
We need to work on bringing communities back before even thinking of reconstruction. We see now that Syrians inside Syria now, they have like their own perspective of Syrians outside Syria. There is a sort of tension between the inside and the outside. And even in areas where there are like IDPs movement, we can see these things. So even before we start reconstruction process, we need to think of how to restore social cohesion in order to allow these people to return. So also reconstruction should be associated of course, with political settlements. And the regime should not lead on this, because we all know that reconstruction conducted by the regime will only lead to more fragmentation of the social cohesion. And we can see that the regime is already claiming that they won the war and defeated ISIS, and will use this to leverage those who led the campaign against ISIS to be able to in areas that they liberated, and this will discourage people from returning to these areas. That's why we need to make sure that before we start the reconstruction process, we need to establish environment that is welcoming IDPs and refugees before even we start the process.
Okay. Yeah, please.
Since you're not asking me, so I
go for it.
I think, in addition to what Ala said, the core component of the social cohesion is trust. So if there is no trust between the individuals and the society and the dominant institutions, here we are talking about the regime, for example, there is no meaning to have a reconstruction process. So any reconstruction process should take into account the trust, or how to enhance the trust between society and the dominant institutions. And unfortunately, what's happening now, as Nadia said in the previous session, it's not a reconstruction process, it's constructing new cities, and not for the majority of people, only for the crony capitalists and warlords. So the trust is deteriorating more and more in Syria, and thus social cohesion, or the current reconstruction process, or the construction process now in the regime controlled area, is contributing in deteriorating more the social cohesion and social capital in the country.
If I can comment on that, also I want to, I concur with my colleagues stated, but also I would add that, and back to the non-state actors that are playing in the Syrian theater now, is that it's not only enough to just talk about the construction or reconstruction or the social, but also the kick-off of the DDR activities, the disarmament, the demobilization, and the reintegration. And one of, I mean, if I were to live in Idlib or Damascus or anywhere, I would not think of starting social cohesion when there is a gun into my face. So starting with, getting rid of all the manifestation of armed violence, I think that's a good start to have the debate and to have the dialogue, the social dialogue starting. So if there is, I don't know in which in programs where that came under, getting rid of the weapons and the arms, but it's within the DDR, and I think it's the transitional phase that comes along with, talking about political transition and also transitional justice. As long as people feel that there is, injustice, they, Syrians are, there is blood, and there is sense of tribalism, there is sense of familism. I mean, these are things that cannot just vanish in a day or even in a short term. There should be kind of thinking from the donors, from the organizations, from us that talk about the social cohesion, to take these things into consideration and push for it, getting rid of these armed scenes, the non-state actors. You have Syrians and non-Syrians. You have competing ideologies. You have Shiite militias. You have Kurdish militias. You have the extremist jihadists in Idlib. It's not only the regime that we have to deal with when it comes to reconstruction. There are many non-state actors that are those non-state actors, the challenges that are related to external players, that they have competing agendas. So I think that should be also taken into consideration when we want to talk about the reconstruction and the process of social cohesion.
Thank you for that. And I think, I agree with you. I think there are many actors who sort of, I guess, sow mistrust or result in the polarization of society. I think that the second question is really, who do we have influence on, and how do you get them to do exactly what you've proposed? And sort of, I'll pose this question to all three of you. In light of the complexity of rebuilding social cohesion, and it does have a lot of intangible concepts within it, what short-term approaches would you propose to advance social cohesion given the context as it is now? And maybe Zaki, we'll start with you this time.
Sure. Actually, the strategy should be aimed to achieve social justice that ensures the social inclusion and integration, that ensures the rights for everyone without discrimination to participate and to express their opinion freely. So the strategy should be to reach or to achieve the social justice in general. Now, the social capital and social cohesion plays a very important role to reach the social justice. This could be happened by activating, again, the components of the social capital. And here I'm talking, for example, about the social networks and participation. What could be done is, or what should be done, is to empower the civil society organizations and initiatives to do their role, and not only empowering them, but also try to open channels between different civil society initiatives in different regions in Syria, so to decrease the polarization status in the country. So civil society initiatives should cooperate between each other in different regions, not only in the same region. And actually, cooperation between civil society initiatives and organizations in one region is very important, but at the same time, it somehow increases the status of polarization in the country. So we have the participation. We have also, in terms of social networks and participation, we have the positive role that could be played by the media in promoting values of freedom and participation. So this is very important also to this component of social capital. Now, in terms of the second component of social capital, which is trust, of course, there is a need to build or to establish impartial and independent judicial institutions. This is very important also to increase the trust between individuals and the de facto authorities, or the institutions, the dominant institutions, if we can say. And at the same time, in terms of the trust, if we are talking about practical steps that could be done, there could be done some kind of mutual economic activities between different regions in Syria. So they have some kind of projects, economic projects, so they have the same objectives and the same interests, and also this increased trust between different parties. Now, in terms of the third component, which is the most complicated one, about the values and norms, the point is that there is a need in Syria after 9 years of crisis. There is a need to reach or to build a new social contract between people, social contract that respect people or human rights and human dignity, social contracts that can overcome the catastrophic impact of the crisis on Syrian people. Also, in terms of norms and values, I think there is a need also to have an agreement about the future development model for Syrian. This model should, of course, overcome the inequality before the crisis and during the crisis in Syria. and to achieve the welfare state for all Syrian people without discrimination. But now the main question is, how are we going to do this? What is the first step? Literature actually answered this question, and all literature review highlight the fact that the accumulation process of creating or generating social cohesion and social capital begins with the dialogue. So the first step to do is to open dialogue between Syrian people. It's not necessarily dialogue at political level, which is very important, but also there is a need to have this kind of dialogue about the future of education, the future of health, the future of the economy. What kind of development model do we need as Syrians? And this dialogue should be between Syrian people and hopefully inside Syria. That's why there is a need to put pressure on the de facto authorities in the country to give people this space, or give the civil society initiatives this space to open this kind of dialogue. Because usually the grassroots dialogue lead to sustainable peace more than the kind of settlement or the kind of the elite level settlements, which most probably will lead to stability, but not to inclusive peace.
Thank you for that. Ala?
I have nothing to add on
I have actually two main points to add to Zaki. Yes, and I will start from his last point. I totally agree, and I will add, for those who are going to ask, how and why would any party would be excited to engage in a dialogue? My answer would be create incentive. We need to create incentives for even the grassroots, leaders or community leaders to come and to push their, let's say, their authoritarian governments, authoritarian, whatever they are in any region, to let them have this space. If we create the incentives, they will give them the space. And there are many examples from around the world. I mean, Turkey was one of them, the EU is one of them. And then I will take it, talking about this, I'll take it to a regional, since it's a regional conflict that has many regional, international players in it. I say if you want to see a solution for, or like a more cohesive social cohesion in Syria, I think we should look at a regional plan similar to the Marshall Plan, because we're talking again to non-state actors. So when we talk about non-state actors, so the problems that we're having here in Syria, it's not different than Iraq, it's not different than Lebanon, and too many regional and international players are involved. So if we get, and again, it should be a Syrian solution. So, and the international society or the international committee should be guiding and should be, kind of an incubator to provide the incentives for such initiatives. And I lastly, conclude by. I read something for a Canadian poet, Aimé Césaire. He said, there is a room for everyone at the rendezvous of victory. So I think it's an inclusive approach, holistic approach, and that's where I think. With Zaki, I concur.
Yeah, actually, I may disagree with you about the Marshall Plan and the. Yeah, it's very important to have this comprehensive plan, but as you said, it should be based on grassroots level discussion. The only incentive or the main incentive that should be for people to be included in any discussion for Syria is to have better Syria in the future. So here we are talking about, I think you are talking about economic incentives and something like that for the main players. But I don't believe, as I said, that the main players or the main actors can reach sustainable peace for Syria. They can reach easily stability with the incentives and with Marshall Plan, but they cannot have or they cannot reach this inclusive peace that stands, I mean, for years and years, and that's better, or that is leading Syria for better situation.
Can I?
No.
I agree. I agree. But if you, I mean, I didn't mean. Let me clarify. I didn't mean Marshall Plan only for Syria. I'm talking about the region. The region that is the neighboring country. Because if you look at Syria, we have two political peace processes. We have Sochi and we have Geneva. Sochi, they meet Turkey, Iran, and Russia, and there is no Syrian there. So if we want to talk about inclusive political process, there is no Syrian on the table. And the second one is Geneva. The contested parties, they're not even on the table. So because it's a regional and international conflict that went out of the Syrian hand, I suggested that, you know, yes, economic, that's true, but also kind of a plan for the region where, I mean, we can discuss this later on, but yeah, this is where I look at it.
Okay, I'd like to open for questions. We'll start here and then over there. Can I just, can we wait until the mic so that they can hear you? And if you could please introduce yourself.
Thank you. My question is to Ala. How do you balance between securing the interest and protection of Syrian refugees and the interests and needs of host countries like Lebanon and Jordan, taking into account that there's no forced return of these refugees, and it's voluntary. If you can clarify that, please. Thank you.
Go ahead.
First of all, how can we assure that it's voluntary return when the UNHCR itself sometimes is not there to monitor the voluntary return? Many of those who have been forced to return from Lebanon were just like put in a bus, and they're by the regime, buses provided by the regime, and saying that it's now time for you to go home.
Can I just say something? I'm from Jordan, so I would just like you to clarify more from Jordan.
Yes,
more.
The same
yes.
For Jordan. As far as I know, there is like, if you can check, like there is a report that have been published yesterday by the European Council on Foreign Relations. If you check, they compared numbers between like returnees from Jordan, the UNHCR numbers, and the numbers provided the government. There is difference in these numbers. Also, it's different from the Russian numbers. So you can see that many of these refugees have been forced to return and are not, like, this returning process is not documented in a proper way that all let's say, international community agree on in order to protect the right of these refugees. Sorry.
But I must emphasize that we do not force any refugee to return back to Syria. I must emphasize that.
Yeah, I'm not saying that technically they're forced, but even before, like, returning these refugees, what procedures are being taken by the Jordanian government or by the UNHCR or any other UN agency to assure that these refugees are not returned to areas that under the regime control and being, like, even arrested or tortured? We've heard a lot of stories that those who have returned have been arrested and tortured. So before even voluntary return is not possible. I don't see it yet happening.
Just one last point. My point is, you were saying that they have to return to areas that had politically settled cities in Syria. And I'm just saying that in the host countries themselves, the resources have been outstretched immensely, and the resources also. So I'm just saying that there's also like a counter argument, and also the job of returning these refugees is the job of the UN agencies themselves. So I'm just saying that the host countries must, their interests must be taken into account. So that's just the point that I wanted to raise. So that's all I was saying.
I agree with you.
Yeah,
that's
all
why
I was
we need
saying.
to address the root causes for this conflict. If we don't work on solving these root causes that have led these people to flee their country, we cannot force them to return. At the same time, I totally understand that the host community, especially Jordan and neighboring countries, true. That's why international.
Just stop this and maybe move on to another question.
Thank you, Ala. You did make very good points, and we both agree on the same points. There's no point of conflict here. Thank you.
Yeah. Hello. Yeah. Hi. I'm Lena. I'm from the War Studies Department in King's. I'm a student. So usually when we talk about social cohesion and social reconstruction after conflict, we think about processes such as, the TRC in South Africa to rebuild that social fabric.
Can you spell that out, please, for people who don't know what you just said?
Sorry, yeah, I'm not finished with the question. So I just wanted to ask if hypothetically we were to have some kind of process in Syria to rebuild the social fabric of our communities, what kind of process would you guys see that happening? Like, what kind of process do you see happening and taking place and being accepted with Syrians?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Actually, the situation in Syria is very difficult. It's not like the situation in South Africa, because we still have the subjugating powers, the same subjugating powers that were fighting together against the will and the interest of Syrian people. But within this difficult conditions, I believe that the first step, as I said, in terms of process, is to ensure or to create this very small space for dialogue for the civil society initiatives or for people, for experts to start or to begin this kind of, let's say, non-political dialogue, if we want or if we have to deal with the de facto subjugating powers. So we can have dialogue about the values, for example, about the idea of justice, about the equality. So this kind of discussion can lead to other projects. I mean, they can be the base for example, projects related to education, pilot project related to health. So I think there is a need to start with very small steps and very gradually. It's a long process. It's not going to happen next year, I mean, to change the situation and to have the Syria that we wanted in 2011. But we need to start, and we need to start gradually.
Point. Very good.
Hi, I'm Basma Alush from the Norwegian Refugee Council. Thanks for this important discussion. I had a question about the role of diaspora in fueling and mitigating conflicts, and how can the diaspora, or what steps can the diaspora take to address and constructively play a role in this issue of social cohesion?
Yeah. It's really important to see that the diaspora come together and agree on basically some of the values and ideas before we approach them too, because I see that we're divided. Even the Syrian diaspora, we're divided, and we need to work together before we start contributing to future Syria. However, I agree with you. They need to take part of future Syria, and because we have now gained knowledge, experience through working with civil societies, and this might help us in addressing the future.
In the back.
Thank you. Ibrahim Alabi, Syrian Legal Development Program. Before I pose the questions, just a quick note that the World Bank early in February issued a report, 360 pages, so makes good bedtime reading, on social cohesion and economic reasons of why people are not returning. So they've analyzed the 100,000 that have returned and the millions that haven't, and did a lot of simulations on that. So it's worth a read, because torture and fear of detention and detainment and forced conscription comes as the primary role for why people are not returning. My question is about the challenges to social cohesion, and I want to get the panel's opinion on a number of those. First of all, how do we distinguish between social cohesion as those with different political opinions or different ideas about what Syria might look like, and those who actively promoted hate speech and war crimes? And I think these are very two different things of people having to live with each other, on those who may have different opinions as to what the state should look like, compared to those who actively endorsed the killing of another group. And then the other challenge is, how do we define the Syrian society? And I looked at the text of the panel, with half of the Syrian society not where it is, and having a huge Syrian society abroad. And Syria itself is no longer one. I mean, by name it's one Syria, but you have different areas of different control. So talking about Syria and Syrians, unfortunately, in 2019, is no longer the same thing. Unfortunately, may have been in 2014, but now it isn't. So aren't all these challenges to addressing cohesion within the Syrian society?
Thank you. Who wants to start?
Do you want to start?
No, it's okay.
It's very interesting questions, very series of questions. But my answer for you is that I agree with the premises of your inquiry, and that's the challenge for all Syrians. But again, to reach to that level, there should be the transitional justice that we talked about, the building of trust. As we all, the panelists agreed, that it's a matter of time to build it. And then when we talked about inclusive social peace or social dialogues, the question would be, who will lead that process, or who will be the guarantee, or who are the guarantors? So that's why when I mentioned the role of international community in that, whether it's the West or China, Russia, or the other players, they are important because they have direct impact on through non-state actors and proxy wars or proxy semi-wars on the ground. So that's why at the end of the day, Syrians in a way, like in different countries, in different areas, those who, let's look at the northeast of Syria. In the same tribes, you see people who signed up for Daesh, you have seen people signed up for Nusra, and some people for Free Syrian Army. I mean, it's not that everybody is embedded or went for the ideology of that certain group. It's because of there is an armed conflict, there is fear. So once the fear, once the reasons and the reason for the reason and those who are fueling this armed conflict stop, I think Syrians will sit, because at the end of the days, and I'm talking about those who committed the crimes that are known. We know them. I mean, they are known. The foreigner is known. The Syrian is known. And I'm not saying it's easy, but we know them. So once we align or mitigate the interference, the external interference, and there is an international real will to impose, the stopping of the freezing of the armed conflict, I think we can reach a level where we, as Zaki mentioned, we can see social dialogues on a very small scale happen. And track 2 is happening. I mean, believe it or not, whether we know it or not, it's happening. It's just that there is no safe space to say it's happening for many other reasons that I mentioned. I don't know if I answered your question, but Zaki, if you have a comment.
Actually, yeah, thank you very much, Brahim, for your question. Actually, I think your two questions are linked together. When you mention the people that invest in political identities and invest in polarization, the result is your second question. The result is that we have this different de facto authorities that they are fighting together, and it's not fair to deal with the result as a fact. We need to deal with the reasons. We need to deal with the root cause of why Syria looks like that now. And you mentioned one of the root cause is how to deal with this huge investment in the identity politics, how to deal with the subjugating powers that spend millions and millions, just like Trump, billions and billions of dollars to invest in hatred, to invest in having more loyal people, to have this current situation in Syria. So I think the answer to your question is to deal with the root cause of the problem and not to be very pragmatic and say, okay, we have now the de facto authorities, we have 3 Syrias, so let's accept the situation. If after the analysis and after the dialogue and after the open public dialogue, Syrian people agree that, okay, we are not Syrians, this is not Syria that we want, okay, but first let's open the space for dialogue. First, let's have the necessary or the appropriate conditions for this kind of dialogue between Syrian people themselves.
We'll just take a question over there, please.
This is Samir Jabour from the American University of Beirut. I'm a researcher of health. From that angle, it seems to me that the discussion we had in the previous panel at the macro level now has an opportunity to be brought into the micro level. And it seems that the discussion on social cohesion must go down to that level if it is to be meaningful, because the investment in social policies promoting cohesion will not be happening. So social cohesion is probably better now thought of as the realm of social resistance, as mounting a grassroots response, a word that was brought up in the previous panel, mounting a grassroots response that emerges from communities in light of the likelihood persistence of everything terrible, from policies to investments and stuff like that. So the question is, from that realm, how does it work in health that you mentioned, in education and all of these things? How can those communities actually do it despite, not facilitated by social policies? Because every indication we have is that everything that has been terrible the past few years will continue. And as a matter of fact, lead to more polarization. So the guidance that those communities are looking for is where possibly there is richness of discussion.
Thank you, Samir, for your question. Actually, as I mentioned, it's a very difficult and long-term process. But this kind of dialogue, currently, for example, as you mentioned, there are very fruitful dialogues at local community level to deal with the health difficulties and to deal with education difficulties. And you know that there are many initiatives happened and is happening inside Syria in different regions to mitigate the impact of the crisis on health and education. But the problem here is that local communities and all these initiatives are focusing on the coping strategies, how to face the impact of the crisis. And unfortunately, I don't know so far any discussion about the strategy for education for the future or strategy for health. So I believe that there is a need to have this kind of balance. It's important to talk about the urgent needs in terms of health, but at the same time, local communities and these initiatives and this dialogue should include also the discussion about the strategic vision for health, taking into account the agreed values between Syrian people, that is, for example, justice, equality, and etc. So if they use these values as basis, they can build on this basis the strategic vision, and not only to deal with the day-to-day, which is important, but not sufficient to deal with the daily activities.
Okay, I'm seeing a lot of hands. In the back over there, please.
Hi, thanks for the discussion. My name is Alexander Wardlaw from the MOD again. Something we saw.
Closer.
Sorry.
Can you put the mic closer?
Sorry. Something we saw at the first sort of stages of the conflict, and into the later stages, that it was a very much east and west, north-south divide in Syria, and I just wonder if it's all well and good we're discussing the challenges to social cohesion, and our friend over there basically put in a much more eloquent way of putting it, but there's so much more challenges than just basic needs here, and the Assad regime is going to try and stick to its guns as much as we can. So how long do you reckon this process is going to take? Is it generations? Is it 10 years? Is it a year? Can we just get your sort of opinion and views on this? Because I think this problem is just so much more complex than just going at grassroots level and hoping for the best.
Yes, you're right. However, the problem is, I mean, to solve a problem, you need to actually admit there is a problem. And when it comes to Assad or the government rhetoric, is that there is no problem. So what we should do is that, as scholars, take a step back and not look at the Syrian crisis context in pro versus, pro regime versus opposition, no matter how much the opposition is fragmented or the Assad regime. The fact is, the social cohesion that we lived, I mean, yes, in 2011 or prior to the revolution, yes, we were living. There was this statement, people who said, oh, now there's the revolution, we were living before. I personally think, yes, for people in bubbles or maybe like cities, we were living, but the social cohesion on many levels is attested and challenged. For instance, one of the things that people would argue is that Syria now is a secular state, and that Assad is the guardian of secularism in Syria. But if you look at the constitution, actually the constitution referred that there are the civil justice is aspired by the Sharia. I don't know which Sharia, but still, the social, the family regulations are ruled by that. So, and then when the Ba'ath Party came to power, it was really one party rule, which means is that it was not a shared vision among Syrians. It's not like Syrians from different groups or different ideas came and they had these dialogues. I don't think now we want to see the social cohesion that was in 2011 or prior to that, because it was fragmented already. It was fragmented, and not in a negative way. Actually, it was fragmented because there was the fear from, again, the intelligence and mukhabarat is paralyzing the whole society. But now with the with the existence of social media, people find this is funny, but I think that the positive impact of what we have been through the 8 years is that we came facing our social problems as Syrians, as young Syrians, and we started to talk about it. There are many topics that we used to not talk about it, and that's healthy. Now, we probably, the acceptance of the other, that's a challenge by itself. I mean, forget the blood, forget the armed conflict, but it's part of like the citizenship. The sense of citizenship is a question. It's a legitimate question that, I probably have an answer. My colleagues here have an answer. But if we sit with people like from different, let's say enclaves that are now, Syrian enclaves, I think everyone might have a different, definition for what Syria is or what Syrian is. But I'm optimistic that there is a common ground. That's not naive, by the way, because again, and this is a very detailed observation, but the Syrian society, whether you are in a city or a suburb, wherever you are, we are, and allow me to say we are conservative society. In social terms, we are conservative. And then the polarization that goes on left or right, that's part of the evolvement of the society. So it's not being naive or not simplifying the situation that we should sit and have a dialogue, because believe it or not, we didn't before that. So I think that's not something that's impossible. I think when certain processes are in place, when there is a will to stop the armed conflict, the freeze of fueling the arms, fueling the ammunition, when there is no gun, or the fear of being abducted by any party, I think that, and that's happening, and it will happen because I think we learned a lesson. That's my answer.
Thank you. Yeah, please, but very brief.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. Actually, just want to mention it's a long-term struggle, but the question is when we know that, okay, we reach the right point, what is the objective of this kind of dialogue and open public dialogue? And I believe that the objective is to contribute in creating other alternatives for Syrian people, because the main issue now that facing Syrian people is the lack of alternatives. They either have the regime or the chaos, of course, because of the regime and all these subjugating powers. So our role, if I can say our role as civil society and civil society initiatives, is to contribute in creating this kind of alternatives for Syrian people to know that there is other alternatives, or there are other alternatives than the current one, which is either the regime or the chaos, which are both lead to, authoritarian regime and lead to a reverse in development process.
Questions? In the middle.
Thank you very much. I'm Tosca Barucco, the chargée d'affaires interne of the European Union for Syria. You will apologize, it's not really a question, but more sharing information about the Brussels III conference that just was held. And I have just a few concepts to share with you. As we saw on the 12th and the 13th of March, over 1,000 between representative and international and regional NGOs, civil society, EU and UN officials gathered in the European Parliament in Brussels to discuss topics ranging from protection to justice and social cohesion. We called those the Day of Dialogues, and they were followed by a ministerial meeting with over 80 delegations and 55 countries present. I could say that in the incredible tragedy of Syria, there is a positive dimension, that is the emergence of an incredibly structured, professional and brave civil society, and that I think should give us hope for the future. The message that was passed under the dialogue was loud and clear to support for civil society dialogue and social cohesion. I think the EU managed to deliver a powerful message of support also to Syrian women who have shouldered so much during the years of war and will be essential in the country revival. A key message was spread that Europe will not let the Syrians down. On social cohesion in particular, you would be thrilled to know that among the themes of our online consultation with civil society that were mentioned as key, justice and social cohesion are the most important element that civil society thinks need to be discussed. And that is also a good input for the discussion we are having now. I will just finish with the pledges because, as you know, it's always a good thing to put figures beyond the face. And the total pledge of the international community reached a record figure of 8.3 billion to meet the needs of the Syrians and neighboring countries. It's the highest pledge we ever reached in our conference. And also we managed to send a strong message of support for the UN-led process in support to Resolution 2254. Thanks a lot, and sorry for the dry figures, but I tried also to put a little bit of heart in what we do. Thanks.
Thank you. Any additional questions, comments in the back over there, please?
Good afternoon. My name is Jean Allegrini. I'm a PhD candidate at University College London, and I mainly work on Lebanon. I had a question. If we look a bit about the Syrian civil war, it resonates a lot with the Lebanese civil war not so long ago. And if we look at the issue of internally displaced Lebanese, we noticed that there were elements that were quite successful in ensuring the return of the internally displaced Lebanese to their homes. So if we take the scenario of the Shuf Mountains, where you had very bloody massacres between Christian Maronites and Druze communities, the Christian Maronites that had fled came back only when the Christian leaders of the Maronite Patriarchate achieved to create dialogue with the Druze community. So I wondered, and we didn't hear about it so far, what would be the role in quite a conservative society, as you have said, of religious leaders? Because I'm not so much convinced about the space you can create about civic organizations, but maybe you can use people that are already there, and that might be instrumental in creating social cohesion, religious leaders. Thank you.
I agree with you. The Lebanese model is a good model to follow. However, Syria is completely different from Lebanon. And we need to understand that we need to stop comparing the Syria case to other neighboring countries. It's not like Iraq, it's not like Syria. However, as you said, we need to involve or establish dialogue between maybe not religious leader, but more community leaders. So inside these, whether host communities or IDPs, bring these community leaders from both communities and establish a dialogue that will lead to, of course, agreeing on values and share social bonds and networks. And this will eventually lead to restoring social cohesion and will, of course, had its positive impact on leading the process of returning these IDPs to their areas. But how can we do this under the having this regime who's not allowing any of these initiative to start?
Sorry, go ahead, Ron.
I just want to comment that you're right about the role of elders and the religious leaders. And if you look at the reconciliation, agreements that happened, it was led by elders and not the head of the armed factions. Yes, that's true, and that's part of the social cohesion that we have been living under for the last, I don't know, since the independence. And that's why I'm saying it's very important that we're having these because Syria is not an institutional, in terms of institution, let's say institution figure. It's based on it has a negative connotation when we talk about tribalism, but if you look at Muqaddimat Ibn Khaldun, the book, it talks heavily about something that's still unfolding until this moment. But it's helping to engage elders, leaders, religious leaders, to participate positively. And I know cases in Lebanon where, one of these is the interfaith dialogue that happens. But yes, it might not unfold into like meaningful, but we see a lot of, for instance, in Damascus, we have IDPs that were, they were out from East Ghouta when it collapsed to Damascus, which is the regime-held territory. One of the good examples is that there are NGOs inside Damascus that let's put the politics aside, okay? Let's say, they work under the Syria Trust, whatever that is, but the young people, the youth that work with the IDPs who came from that, they were very open in working with those IDPs, and there was no feeling of fear or distrust. Why? Because those volunteers and those NGOs, they were having trainings and workshops in various organizations in Lebanon. I'm not going to name the organization, but it's happening. So when you put politics aside, and when you have young people working with those ITPs who are fearing from the hosting, and I'm talking about Damascus, I still see this little spark of positiveness and hope. Again, I'm not being naive. It's successful stories on a very small scale level, but it's happening, which means that, put politics aside, there's a space for social cohesion to improve and flourish.
Can I add something? Yeah. I disagree with you, Erwan. Those volunteers who worked under Syria Trust, they didn't fear working with IDPs, not because they felt...
No, I meant IDPs. IDPs feared them. They didn't fear them.
IDPs didn't fear volunteers. Yeah. Because you said because they were trained in Lebanon.
Yeah, but they did not fear. Did not fear them in a sense that they refused to work with them because there were cases.
Of course, they're in need. That's why anyone who's providing them with aid, they will of course deal with them. But we cannot say that Syria Trust is let's put politics aside because it is part of the problem. Having Asma al-Assad leading on this development process and claiming that they are the only one who knows what's happening in Syria is the problem. And we cannot say that, there is empowering movement happening inside Syria and trained and all these things. So I'm sorry, I'm just being honest. I need to express this, sorry.
Okay. There's obviously social cohesion tension here, and I think this actually exemplifies. No, it's true. But I'm being very, very serious because this exemplifies really the policy problem that we're trying to get at. There are very serious political divisions within the Syrian conflict that are causing polarization. The question is, do you compromise on the political position to get some grassroots movement or not? And I honestly don't expect this to be resolved here, but I think when we're talking about social cohesion, and since there's been pledges towards programming that deals with social cohesion, this is actually one of the questions that we do need to address. And I go back to Dr. Samir's point, is that you have the political political level, you have the grassroots level, and these are different levels that you would need to deal with as well. So I mean, take this panel as an opportunity to pose all of these questions, to think about them collectively. I don't expect that we'll have these answers here, but I think this was the perfect example of what we're up against, right? I don't know, Zaki, if you have any final words.
I just have a comment about the, back to the question. Actually, I don't believe that this is also social cohesion. I disagree. I don't believe that the Lebanese model is the best model about social cohesion after the crisis. And yeah, but my point is that I think using the non-state actors, for example, the religious leaders, who are controlled by the subjugating powers, to do the reconciliation will never ever lead to sustainable peace. That's why we are a bit, dreamers, but we want civil society initiatives, the people to discuss between each other and not to have this buffer or this, religious leaders or any kind of leaders that used to be dominated or they're still dominated by subjugating powers to reach the social cohesion. Yeah.
Thank you. And I think, we have exactly 2 minutes. So if you can give me your question in one so that we can get a chance to respond and wrap up.
Hi, Selma again. I wanted to go back to Lebanon because I think there are some lessons to be learned from Lebanon, in particular on the role that civil society can play when there's no political will or there's no policies, as you were saying. I think we can draw some good examples of what can be done, but also to look at the limits of what civil society can do when there are no policies and when there's no political will. So it kind of looks at the question of the question regarding truth reconciliation commissions, and I think that's not a good example, but I think we need to look around the world for those examples where without political will and without an actual transition and without space for real justice, what can we do to build community resilience and resistance, and to look at what civil society can do.
Thank you.
It's not a question again, sorry. I'm
That's
really
okay.
bad.
And on that note, I'd like to wrap up. Please join me in thanking our excellent panelists for their contributions.